After church last week, both in person and via email, from people in the room and people on the live stream, I heard from people about the sermon, which was focused on those who seek refuge on our shores. One person said to me, I wanted to stand up and applaud at the end. Another said I was moved to tears. Another told me about still carrying their own pain of being told, go back where you came from, by a stranger decades ago. Another wrote to describe it as a feast. But there were others who were not fans, who said, I heard politics, and politics don't belong in church. And I'm sure there are those who were not pleased who just haven't made that known to me. So while I am going to talk about Jesus blessing the children in a bit, I first want to take time to let you know where I'm coming from and what role I think the church plays in relation to our political lives. I hope that in these frayed and anxious days before the election, this can help turn down the temperature a bit and give everybody something to think about. So first, whether you loved the sermon, hated it, or are not quite sure, you might be surprised to learn that I'm always happy to find out what people honestly think, even when it's critical. On a very broad level, it has been my goal since the first day of my ministry 30 years ago to try to make the churches I serve a place where diverse voices can be in dialogue. While I always want to make my case for how I see the teachings of the Bible in general and of Jesus in particular as strongly as I can make it, I do not want to end up with a congregation that's just an echo chamber representing only one point of view. If we can't find a way to hang together as a church family while holding different beliefs about important issues, then I have failed as a pastor. I actually have this kind of warped goal to have every person in the church disturbed by at least one sermon that I have preached over the years. Sometimes I even disturb myself. Unless our worldview is shaken up on at least one occasion, we will stop growing spiritually. Even if after being shaken up and thinking about it, you end up in the same place that you were beforehand. We need the shake up every now and again. We need to keep growing. The second reason I'm grateful to hear criticism as well as praise is because it helps me become a better communicator. There have been quite a few times throughout my career when somebody has told me on the way out that they disagreed with me saying such and so, when I had no intention of saying that at all. It's like, what? I said that? I didn't mean to say that. So I was obviously not clear, and on those occasions I have to go back through and say, all right, what did I say and how did I say it that landed with this person this way? Other times, people have told me how upset they were at something and then have shared a life experience that shaped their own different view on the matter. In quite a few cases, their experience has opened my eyes to how my own belief about something has been limited simply because I haven't lived in other people's shoes. Over the years, writing sermons has become infinitely harder as I now try to consider how my words will land with people who have had this kind of experience and that kind of experience and have come from this place, and to be clear about all of it because I know there are experiences that I have yet to be told about. I definitely appreciate tact in conveying criticism, but if something really troubles you, we will be a stronger church and I will be a more effective pastor if you let me know about it. I will still love you. You will still be welcome here. As many others have said before me, what we seek in the church is unity, not uniformity. There was a man in the Dover church who frequently gave me critical feedback about Sunday morning, sometimes with tact and sometimes without it. Over time, I came to know what he liked and what he hated and could predict that on a very regular basis. And there came a Sunday when I knew he was going to hate the sermon. We had a church dinner the night before, so I went and sat down next to him. I told him that he should really consider staying home the next morning because he was really, really going to hate the sermon. And I told him what it was, and I told him why. And he was pretty shocked. He said, "I don't think I've ever had a pastor tell me to stay home on a Sunday morning." The next morning, he was there with bells on. No pastor was going to tell him to stay home from church on a Sunday. And on the way out, he said, with some defiance, "That wasn't so bad." We loved each other. Unity, not uniformity. I also want to lay out where the line is for me in terms of politics in the church. In one sense, the Bible isn't a lot of help here, since both in the Old and New Testaments, religion and politics were joined at the hip. In the days of the kings of Israel, Israel was a theocracy. The kings had court prophets to bring them messengers from God about how to rule the kingdom on very specific ways, to point out where the king in any given instance had gone afoul of God's word. In the New Testament, Israel is an occupied country, a newly conquered colony of the Roman Empire. But under Roman rule, the religion of a given colony was allowed to operate kind of within certain limits. In Israel in Jesus' time, the day-to-day political and judicial actions of the colony were handled by the Sanhedrin, which was a political body but made up of Jewish religious leaders. The only guidance on religion and politics we get from Jesus is his teaching that people should pay their taxes, as he looked at the coin with Caesar's face on it and said, "Well, give to Caesar what's Caesar's and give to God what is God's." We also have his crowning example of submitting to his own unjust execution rather than engaging in violence against the occupying empire. In times and places where the church and government have been separate and distinct entities, as is mandated in our own Constitution here in the US, the separation called for is a separation of powers, not a separation of issues. As far as what is allowed for a church legally in terms of political action, a church can, for example, host candidates for public office, even to preach on a Sunday morning, as long as all candidates are invited. In August of 2008, you might remember the non-denominational California megachurch Saddleback hosted the Saddleback Civil Forum on the presidency. On the same night, both Barack Obama and John McCain were interviewed by Saddleback's pastor, Rick Warren, about where they stood on issues that were important to Christian faith. Not their personal beliefs, although they were free to discuss that, but on the specific policies that each supported and how each one saw those policies connecting to the faith that they held. And both men were professing Christians. None of that violated their nonprofit status as a church because both candidates were invited to participate. And even if only one of them had accepted the invitation and shown up, they would still be in compliance as long as the invitation was extended to both. But the invitation was extended by the pastor of a huge church in the first place because the laws and policies that govern the country have real impacts on the lives of everyone who lives here. And because of our country's size and influence, on many who live in other parts of the world. There is nothing so fundamental to Jesus' teaching as examining how we treat others, especially the poor and the marginalized. And since churches can be in trouble and individual Christians arrested for breaking the laws of the state, the policies of candidates for office at all levels of government are of fundamental interest to people of faith. Those policies, once they're enacted, will affect the lives of every person. As a reminder, the civil rights movement was a movement largely begun in the Ebenezer Baptist Church under the leadership of its pastor, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And it was successful because of the involvement of churches and religious leaders across the country. Churches were regularly bombed by state and local governments. Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail takes his white clergy friends to school for not wanting to rock the boat or to wait until some magical time when taking meaningful steps towards racial desegregation wasn't going to upset people. On the Catholic side of the ledger, we have Dorothy Day, who established the Catholic Workers' Movement in the 1930s, a pacifist movement that combines direct aid for the poor and homeless with nonviolent direct action on their behalf. Dorothy Day was arrested numerous times, including in 1973 when she was 75 years old. Pope Benedict and Pope Francis both lauded her efforts. She died in 1980, and the Catholic Church is now in the process of making her a saint. That process is now complete for St. Oscar Romero, who was a conservative archbishop in San Salvador in the 1970s, who spoke out against social injustice and violence during the escalating conflict between the military government and left-wing insurgents that led to the Salvadoran Civil War. In 1980, Romero was shot by an assassin, hired by the founder of a right-wing political party in the country. He was shot and killed while conducting Mass. He was canonized as a saint in 2018. When children of God are disenfranchised, assaulted, abused, bombed, and killed anywhere, it is the duty of the church everywhere to remind us of what our faith has to say about the matter. The United Methodist Church has a section of our Book of Discipline called the Social Principles. Translated now into 9 languages, it has 4 broad categories of social issues: community of all creation, the economic community, the social community, and the political community. Under each category, it lists the official position of the United Methodist Church on every issue under the sun. Just under the topic of the political community, you will find full discussions on the following topics: church and governments, restorative justice, criminal justice, healthcare, elders and the aging, men and boys, migrants, immigrants, and refugees, sexual orientations and gender identities, civil disobedience, the death penalty, war and military service, children and young people, women and girls, indigenous, native, and aboriginal communities, people with disabilities, and religious minorities. Just in that one section, you can get the official position of the Methodist Church on all that. All the subjects are revisited every 4 years at General Conference. The list I just read is the list from 2024. Importantly, the United Methodist Church doesn't require agreement with the official stand on any of those issues in order to be a member. It doesn't even require agreement from the clergy. It does require that if I'm going to take a public position on something that's in opposition to the social principles, that I disclose that as part of what I say. From the above list, I'm going to read you the section titled Church and Governments. Quote, "We affirm that both church and state have vital and distinct roles to play in relation to the larger society. Though the formal relationships between religious communities and governments vary from country to country, we generally affirm the independence and integrity of both institutions, and we advocate for a relationship of mutual respect in which neither institution seeks to dominate or unduly influence the other. We affirm that every form of government stands under God's judgment and must therefore be held accountable for protecting the innocent, guaranteeing basic freedoms and liberties, protecting the natural world, and establishing just, equitable, and sustainable economies. We urge those elected or appointed to public posts or holding other positions in government to act as responsible leaders and stewards of the authority and resources entrusted to them. We call on all government officials to aspire to the highest standards of professionalism, honesty, and integrity. Furthermore, we urge all governments to adopt policies and practices that guarantee accountability and transparency in fostering and maintaining the trust of the public. We reject governmental use of threats, extortion, unlawful detentions, extrajudicial killings, and other forms of coercion to silence political opponents, and those objecting to unlawful or immoral government policies and practices. In keeping with intentional laws and ordinances, we vehemently protest the use of torture, slavery, genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes of aggression by any government, and call for the strictest international sanctions to be imposed in such cases. And they close with this. While we do not believe churches should affiliate with particular political parties, we do encourage churches to speak out boldly on social issues from a gospel perspective. We further believe churches have a right and a responsibility to educate and equip their members to be effective advocates for justice in the wider world. The end. I agree with every word of that. When parents brought their children to see Jesus, his own disciples thought the children were a nuisance, undeserving of all of Jesus' time and attention. Jesus shut that down pretty quickly, told all within earshot that the innocent wonder of children is key to finding our way into God's world, and then brought the children close and blessed them. The thing I want to point out about this story is the nature of giving a blessing. The Greek word is eulogeo, the word that gives us the English word eulogy, the words of praise often spoken at a funeral about the deceased. In the Gospels, it is what Jesus does when he blesses the bread at the Last Supper and elsewhere. When Jesus talks of the day of his return and describes people as saying then, as we say in the communion liturgy, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. That word is eulogeo. It's also what Jesus tells us to do even for our enemies. Eulogeo, to bless, means to speak well of, to consecrate, and to cause to prosper. That's why the blessings we say during the communion liturgy are called consecrating the elements. To consecrate is to proclaim something as sacred to God and therefore worthy of care and attention. It isn't magic. A blessing doesn't change the inherent nature of a thing, but it does proclaim intention by the one doing the blessing. It's a proclamation of God's presence in whatever or whomever is being blessed, and serves as a promise to protect and help whatever is blessed to prosper. I don't know of any issue today that doesn't impact children, either today's children and or those in generations to come. And whatever it affects children, affects families, both their families of origin and for generations to come, as those children grow up and use their own experiences as children to raise their own. We see those cycles play out again and again and again. So my question today is, are we blessing the children? Do we see them, all of them, as sacred and worthy of our care and attention? How would we know that when we saw it? Here are some statistics I compiled this week. This is from the United Way on October 15th, 2024. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, Over 9 million kids in the United States live below the federal poverty line. It's also higher for certain ethnic and racial groups. 25.9% of kids live in poverty for Native American children, 19.5% for Hispanic children, 17.8% for Black children, 11.2% for white children, and 9.2% for Asian children. Different source from Macaroni Kid, a publishing network devoted to raising awareness about children's issues. August 19th, 2024. The cost of raising a child jumped almost 20% from 2016 to 2021 to an average of $21,681 per child. Costs do differ by state. States were ranked by the cost of necessities, so no educational costs in there. Necessities including childcare, additional housing, food, medical care, and transportation for a child raised by 2 working adults. Which state costs the most to raise a child? Massachusetts, $35,841 per child. It's more than some people make. The American Journal of Managed Care in January 2023 reported that the U.S. has the highest infant and maternal mortality rates out of 38 other high-income countries, while simultaneously spending the most of any of those countries on health care. Every single country in the study guarantees government or public health coverage to all residents, except who? Us, the United States, where 8.6% of the population has no form of health insurance as of 2021. A 2023 study published by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention found 367 accidental gun deaths of children ages 0 to 5 years old, and 176 deaths of children from 6 to 10 years old. 2 out of 3 of the gun deaths of children 0 to 5 were self-inflicted, from playing with a firearm or showing it off to others. In 99% of all reported deaths in that 0 to 5 age group, the gun had been stored both loaded and unlocked. Accidental gun deaths in the 6 to 10-year-old bracket were more likely to be inflicted by someone else, almost half by children between 11 and 17 years old, most of whom were also playing with the firearm and showing it off to others. More than 8 in 10 deaths in that older age group involved guns that were stored both loaded and unlocked. And that's before we get to the issues that affect children simply because they will be the ones to inherit the world we leave for them. If we don't mend our divisions, they will inherit the hate. If we don't step up to protect the planet, they will inherit fire and flood. But if we model loving our neighbors, if they see us not only saying, "bless you" when someone sneezes, or saying that they count in church, but working on their behalf outside, to help ensure that every child has the same opportunity to grow and prosper, live and love, learn and follow their dreams, then we'll be able to say, we have blessed our children. And when one day they stand to offer a word at our passing, they might bless us with a true eulogy in return. Our children cry out for our blessing. Will we hear them? Our choir anthem this morning, Prayer of the Children, by Wisconsin native Kurt Bestor, was written as a way to vent his frustration over the civil war and ethnic cleansing taking place in the former country of Yugoslavia in the 1980s, having lived in the region for much of the 1970s. It was more than a decade before the song was ever performed, Bestor never intended to publish it. He wrote it as a way to get it off his chest. But one day he sang it himself to help fill in the time in a 2-hour concert in the mid-1990s, and it took off. The piece has now been recorded by over 100 choirs, has been used at the annual 9/11 remembrance, at an annual memorial service for the Columbine High School tragedy, and at a concert in memory of the Oklahoma City bombing. The lyrics are in your bulletin, and you'll hear them again as the pastoral prayer later in the service. Can you hear the prayer of the children?